Germany, April 11, 1945. A young American soldier named Robert Persinger was 22 years old. He was from Ohio. He had been in Europe for 8 months. He had seen combat in France. He had seen his friends die. He thought he had seen the worst that war could offer. He was wrong. His unit reached a town called Nordhausen in central Germany. The town was mostly destroyed, bombed-out buildings, empty streets. The German army had retreated days earlier. The Americans expected to find civilians, maybe some stragglers. What they found instead was hell. Near the edge of town, there was a tunnel entrance built into the side of a mountain. The entrance was large enough to drive a truck through. A terrible smell was coming from inside. Persinger and 3 other soldiers were ordered to investigate. They walked into the tunnel. The smell got worse. Rotting flesh, human waste, chemicals. One of the soldiers vomited immediately. The tunnel opened into a massive underground factory. Miles of tunnels carved into the mountain. Electric lights hanging from the ceiling. Assembly lines, machine tools, and bodies. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, stacked against the walls like cordwood, piled in corners, lying where they had fallen. Most of them were nothing but skin and bones, skeletons in striped prison uniforms. There were survivors, too, men who looked more dead than alive. They were wandering through the tunnels in a daze. Some of them could not speak. Some of them just stared. One man grabbed Persinger's arm. He said something in a language Persinger did not understand. French, maybe, or Polish. The man was crying. Persinger did not know what to do. He gave the man his canteen. The man drank and then collapsed. The army brought in medics, photographers, film crews. They wanted to document what they had found. The photographs from that day are some of the most horrific images of World War II. Bodies everywhere. Survivors who looked like walking corpses. American soldiers standing in shock, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. This place had a name, Mittelbau Dora. It was a concentration camp, but it was also a factory. The prisoners were not just killed here, they were worked to death. Building weapons, building rockets, building a machine called the V2. And the man who designed that machine, the man who oversaw its production, the man who visited this factory and watched prisoners die and did nothing to stop it. His name was Wernher von Braun, and in 4 years he would be the highest-paid rocket scientist in the United States Army. This is a story about a deal between the United States government and Nazi war criminals. A deal where America traded justice for technology, where it erased the past to win the future, where it paid men with blood on their hands and then lied about it for 60 years. The deal had a name, Operation Paperclip, and it cost more than money. It cost truth, it cost integrity, and it cost the lives of the men who tried to stop it from happening. Robert Persinger never forgot what he saw in those tunnels. When he came home to Ohio, he did not talk about it much. It was too awful, too painful. But in 1969, when the moon landing happened, when everyone in America was celebrating, when Walter Cronkite was crying on television and calling it the greatest achievement in human history, Persinger watched Wernher von Braun on the screen. The man in the control room, the hero, the genius, the father of the American space program. And Persinger turned off the television because he knew the truth. He knew where those rockets came from. He knew what it cost to build them. He knew that the triumph everyone was celebrating was built on a foundation of bones. But most Americans did not know, because their government had lied to them. And the lie worked. This is how it happened. Germany, 1943. 2 years before Persinger walked into those tunnels. The V2 rocket program was in full production. The rocket itself was a marvel, 46 feet tall, 14 tons. It could fly at 3,500 miles per hour. It could reach an altitude of 100 miles. It could strike a target 200 miles away. It was the first object made by humans to reach space. It was the ancestor of every rocket that came after it, every missile, every satellite, every spacecraft. The technology that put men on the moon started here. but building it required resources that Nazi Germany did not have. Each V2 cost approximately 120,000 Reichsmarks to build. That was the equivalent of 50,000 US dollars in 1943 money. For comparison, a German Panzer tank cost 30,000 Reichsmarks. A Messerschmitt fighter plane cost 60,000. The V2 was twice as expensive as a fighter plane, and a fighter plane could fly dozens of missions. The V2 flew once. One launch, one explosion, then you needed another rocket. The entire V2 program consumed roughly 2 billion Reichsmarks between 1942 and 1945. That was half the cost of building the entire German tank force for the same period. It was an insane allocation of resources for a weapon that had almost no strategic impact. The V2 killed approximately 3,000 civilians in England and Belgium. Terrible, tragic. But 3,000 deaths did not change the outcome of the war. The strategic bombing campaign by the Allies killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians and crippled German industry. The V2 program accomplished nothing except draining resources from more effective weapons. So why did Germany build it? Because Adolf Hitler was desperate. By 1943, Germany was losing. The Wehrmacht had been defeated at Stalingrad. The Allies had landed in Italy. German cities were being bombed around the clock. Hitler needed a miracle weapon, something that would change the course of the war. The V2 was supposed to be that weapon. It was supposed to terrorize London into surrender. It did not work, but Hitler kept pouring money into it anyway because he had no other options, and the labor for this project came from concentration camps. Mittelwerk, the underground factory, was built using prisoners from Mittelbau-Dora and other camps. The prisoners worked 12 to 16-hour shifts. They assembled rocket components in freezing tunnels with no ventilation. They breathed metal dust and chemical fumes. They were beaten if they worked too slowly. They were beaten if they made mistakes. They were beaten for no reason at all. The food was starvation rations, watery soup, a piece of bread, sometimes nothing. The prisoners slept on wooden bunks in unheated barracks. Many of them had dysentery, tuberculosis, typhus. There was almost no medical care. If you got sick, you kept working until you collapsed. If you collapsed, the guards dragged you aside and left you to die. At the end of each day, a crew collected the bodies and took them to the crematorium. Approximately 20,000 prisoners died at Mittelbau-Dora between 1943 and 1945. Some estimates go higher, 25,000, 30,000. The SS did not keep accurate records. They did not care. The prisoners were not people to them. They were units of production, replaceable, disposable. More people died building the V2 than died from the V2 hitting its targets. Think about that. The weapon killed fewer enemies than it killed slaves. By any measure of military or economic efficiency, the V2 was a catastrophic failure. But it was not built for efficiency. It was built for propaganda, for the illusion of German technological superiority, for the fantasy that science could defeat reality. And Wernher von Braun was at the center of it all. Von Braun was born in 1912 into an aristocratic Prussian family. His father was a baron. His mother gave him a telescope when he was 13. He became obsessed with space. He read Jules Verne, H.G. Wells. He dreamed of building rockets that would take humans to the moon, to Mars, to the stars. He was a true believer, a visionary. And like many visionaries, he did not care much about the human cost of achieving his vision. In 1932, when von Braun was 20 years old, the German army offered him funding to develop rockets. He said yes immediately. He did not ask what the rockets would be used for. He did not care. He wanted to build rockets, and someone was offering to pay him to do it. That was enough. By 1937, he had joined the Nazi Party. Party number 5,738,692. He would later claim that membership was required for his job, that he had no choice. This is not entirely true. Many German scientists and engineers worked for the military without joining the party. But joining opened doors. It showed loyalty. It made career advancement easier. Von Braun joined because it was convenient. In 1940, he joined the SS Schutzstaffel, Heinrich Himmler's elite organization, the group that ran the concentration camps. That organized the Holocaust. That carried out mass executions across Europe. Von Braun became an officer, SS Sturmbannführer, equivalent to a major. He wore the black uniform with the silver skull and crossbones on the collar. He attended SS ceremonies. He reported to SS superiors. After the war, von Braun claimed he was forced to join the SS, that Himmler personally pressured him, that he would have lost his job if he refused. But there is a problem with this story. There is a letter in the archives, written by von Braun in 1939, addressed to an SS superior. In the letter, von Braun thanks the SS for their support of his research. He writes that he is honored to contribute to the Reich's victory. He closes with Heil Hitler. This is not the letter of a man who was forced. This is the letter of a man who was willing, who saw an opportunity and took it, who decided that his dreams were more important than the methods used to achieve them. By 1943, von Braun was the technical director of the V2 program. He was not just designing rockets in an office, he was managing production, making decisions about manufacturing, solving problems, and that meant visiting the factories where the rockets were built, including Mittelwerk. There is documentation of von Braun's visits to Mittelwerk, travel records, witness testimony. He was there, multiple times. He walked through the tunnels. He inspected the assembly lines. He spoke with the SS engineers who managed the slave labor. He saw the prisoners. He saw the conditions. He knew what was happening. One witness was a French engineer named Adam Kabala. Before the war, Kabala worked for a French aerospace company. When Germany occupied France, Kabala joined the resistance. He was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943 and sent to Dora. Because he had engineering skills, he was assigned to work on VAZ-2 assembly. After the war, Kabala gave testimony at a trial. He described seeing von Braun at Mittelwerk in the winter of 1944. Von Braun was wearing a long leather coat, clean, expensive. He was accompanied by SS officers. They walked through the factory inspecting the work. Von Braun stopped at one of the assembly stations. He asked questions about a fuel tank component. The SS engineer explained a problem they were having, a welding issue that was causing delays. While they were talking, a prisoner collapsed. He had been carrying a heavy piece of metal. He dropped it and fell to his knees. He was coughing. Blood was coming out of his mouth. He had tuberculosis. He was dying. An SS guard walked over and started beating the man with a wooden club, hitting him in the back, in the ribs, screaming at him to get up, to get back to work. The prisoner could not get up. He just curled into a ball while the guard kept hitting him. Kabala said that von Braun was standing about 20 feet away. He saw the whole thing. He watched for maybe 10 seconds. Then he turned back to the SS engineer and continued the conversation about the welding problem. He did not tell the guard to stop. He did not object. He did not react at all. The prisoner was just background noise, an inconvenience, a delay in the production schedule. The prisoner died 3 days later. The welding problem was fixed. Production continued. This is who Wernher von Braun was. Not a monster who enjoyed cruelty, but something worse. A man who did not care, who could watch a human being beaten to death and feel nothing except annoyance that it was disrupting his work, who valued rocket components more than human lives. And this is the man that the United States government decided to protect, to hire, to pay, to turn into a hero. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Soviets were advancing from the east. The Americans and British were advancing from the west. It was obvious that the war was lost. The only question was when. And what would happen to the people who had worked for the Nazi regime? Von Braun knew that he had 3 options. He could stay in Germany and face Allied justice, probably execution or a long prison sentence. He could be captured by the Soviets. That would mean either a bullet in the head or a lifetime of forced labor in Siberia. Or he could surrender to the Americans. The Americans had money, technology, resources, and they might be willing to make a deal. Von Braun chose option 3. In April 1945, he gathered his top engineers, about 500 of them. He told them to pack everything important: documents, blueprints, test data, calculations, everything they had learned from building the V2. They loaded 14 tons of documents into trucks, and they drove south, toward the American lines, away from the advancing Soviet army. On May 2, 1945, von Braun's brother, Magnus, approached an American checkpoint on a bicycle. He spoke English. He told the American soldiers that his brother, Wernher von Braun, the famous rocket scientist, wanted to surrender. He said they had 500 engineers and tons of technical documents. He said they were ready to work for America. The American soldiers were confused. This was not in their training manual. They called their commanding officer. The commanding officer called his superior. Word went up the chain of command. Within hours, American intelligence officers arrived. They interviewed von Braun. They looked at the documents. They realized what they had. They had just captured the most advanced rocket technology on the planet, technology that was worth billions of dollars, technology that the Soviets desperately wanted, technology that could give the United States a decisive advantage in the next war, the war that everyone knew was coming. The Cold War. The intelligence officers sent urgent reports to Washington. They said that von Braun and his team were essential, that their knowledge could save the United States a decade of research and hundreds of millions of dollars, that if America did not take them, the Soviets would. They recommended immediate recruitment, but there was a problem. Von Braun and his engineers were Nazis. Some of them were SS officers. They had used slave labor. They had overseen facilities where thousands of people died. Under U.S. law, they were inadmissible. They were supposed to be prosecuted as war criminals, not hired as employees. Washington had to make a choice: follow the law and lose the technology, or break the law and win the Cold War. They chose to break the law, and then they lied about it. Washington, D.C., March 1945. In a secure conference room in the Pentagon, 7 men sat around a table. 4 of them were military officers. 2 were from the Office of Strategic Services, the organization that would become the CIA. 1 was a civilian scientist named Samuel Goudsmit. Goudsmit was 53 years old. He was born in the Netherlands, Jewish. He had emigrated to the United States in 1927 to teach physics at the University of Michigan. When war broke out, he tried to get his parents to leave Europe. They refused. They were elderly. They did not want to leave their home. In 1943, the Nazis deported them to Auschwitz. They were murdered in the gas chambers. Now Goudsmit was sitting in a Pentagon conference room talking about recruiting Nazi scientists. The irony was not lost on him. One of the army officers laid out the situation. Soviet forces were already in eastern Germany. They were looting factories, seizing equipment, rounding up scientists and engineers. Some of the scientists were going voluntarily. The Soviets were offering good salaries, research facilities, protection from prosecution. Others were being taken by force, loaded onto trains, and shipped to the Soviet Union. Either way, the Soviets were winning the race for German technology. The officer said that if the United States did not act immediately, the best scientist would end up working for Stalin. And that would be a disaster. The next war, the war against communism, would be won by whoever had the best weapons, the best rockets, the best planes, the best missiles, and right now the Germans were ahead of everyone, years ahead. If the Soviets got that technology, America would spend the next decade playing catch-up. A Navy officer asked the obvious question: what about the law? What about the moral implications? Many of these scientists were Nazis. Some of them had committed war crimes. The United States had just fought a war to defeat fascism. How could it turn around and hire fascists? There was a long silence. Then Goudsmit spoke. He chose his words carefully. He said that he understood the moral concerns better than anyone in the room, that he had lost his parents to the Nazis, that he hated them with every fiber of his being. But he also understood that this was not about morality. It was about survival. He said that the Soviet Union was not going to hesitate. They were going to take every scientist they could find. They were going to use them to build weapons. And if the United States refused to do the same out of principle, then America would lose the next war. And losing that war would mean that everything they had just fought for, all the sacrifices, all the deaths, would be for nothing. He said that sometimes the right thing to do is the wrong thing to do, that you have to choose between 2 bad options, that refusing to recruit these scientists would not bring back the concentration camp victims. It would just hand the future to Stalin. One of the OSS officers agreed. He said the math was simple. Either we take these scientists or the Soviets take them. Either way, they are going to build rockets and bombs. The only question is who they build them for. And he would rather have them building for America than building for Moscow. The decision was made. The United States would recruit German scientists. It would be done quickly, quietly, and it would be kept secret from the American public. The program was given a code name, Operation Overcast. Later, for security reasons, the name was changed to Operation Paperclip. The name came from the method of marking files. When a scientist was approved for immigration, a paperclip was attached to his folder. The military lawyers drafted guidelines. Do not recruit anyone who was a major war criminal. Do not recruit anyone who was a member of the Nazi Party leadership. Do not recruit anyone who was directly involved in medical experiments or mass murder. Focus on the technical people, the engineers, the scientists, the people who were just doing their jobs. These guidelines sounded reasonable, but in practice they were impossible to follow. Because when the intelligence teams got to Germany and started interviewing scientists, they discovered that almost all of them were Nazis, not just party members, officers, SS members, men who had worked at facilities that used slave labor, men who had overseen programs that killed thousands of people. If the guidelines were followed strictly, there would be almost no one to recruit, so the guidelines were ignored. And a new system was created, a system of lies, Germany. May 1945. American intelligence teams were racing across their occupation zone. They had lists of scientists, locations of research facilities. They were competing against the Soviets. Every factory that fell into Soviet hands was a factory that America lost. Every scientist that the Soviets captured was one less scientist for America. The teams were authorized to offer deals. Come work for us. We will pay you. We will protect you. We will bring your family to America. You will have a good life. Just tell us everything you know. Most of the scientists said yes, because the alternative was staying in Germany, which was a pile of rubble, or being captured by the Soviets, which was a death sentence. The Americans were offering safety, money, a future. Of course, they said yes, but there was a problem. The scientists had Nazi backgrounds, and under U.S. immigration law, Nazis were not allowed to enter the country. President Truman had signed an executive order. It said that no member of the Nazi Party could get a visa to the United States. The State Department was supposed to enforce this. Every visa application was supposed to be screened. Anyone with Nazi ties was supposed to be rejected. So the intelligence agencies came up with a solution. They would create two sets of files. One set would be accurate. It would contain the truth, party memberships, SS ranks, evidence of war crimes, witness statements, everything. These files would be classified, locked away, marked top secret. Only people with the highest security clearance would see them. The second set of files would be sanitized. All the problematic information would be removed. The Nazi Party memberships would be described as forced or involuntary. The SS memberships would be omitted entirely. The evidence of war crimes would disappear. The sanitized files would make these men look like innocent scientists who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Victims of the regime, not participants. This was not an accident. This was not sloppiness. This was deliberate policy. There are memos in the archives, written instructions on how to sanitize the files, what to remove, what language to use, how to create a false but believable narrative. One memo, written by an Army intelligence officer in June 1945, is explicit. It says, the following individuals are of high intelligence value to the United States. However, their backgrounds include information that would make them inadmissible under current immigration law. It is recommended that files be prepared for State Department review which emphasize technical qualifications and minimize political affiliations. Minimize. That was the word they used. Not hide, not erase, minimize. As if being an SS officer was just a minor detail, as if overseeing slave labor was just a footnote. Wernher von Braun's file was one of the most heavily edited. The original file, prepared by British intelligence officers who interviewed him in May 1945, was damning. It stated clearly that von Braun was a member of the Nazi Party and the SS. It noted that he had worked at Mittelwerk and other facilities that used concentration camp labor. It included witness statements from former prisoners. It recommended that von Braun be held for war crimes investigation. The sanitized file told a different story. It said that von Braun joined the Nazi Party reluctantly under pressure from superiors. It said that his SS membership was honorary and ceremonial, that he never wore the uniform and had no operational role in SS activities. This was a lie. There are photographs of von Braun in SS uniform, but those photographs were classified and kept out of the sanitized file. The sanitized file made no mention of Mittelwerk. It made no mention of slave labor. It described von Braun as a brilliant engineer who had been focused solely on scientific research, a man who had no interest in politics, a man whose only crime was being born in the wrong country at the wrong time. This false file was sent to the State Department for visa approval, and the State Department, which did not have access to the original file, approved it. But not everyone went along with the lie. One man tried to stop it. His name was Samuel Klaus. He was a lawyer in the State Department's visa division. His job was to screen visa applications and identify war criminals. In late 1945, Klaus received a stack of applications from German scientists who were working for the U.S. Army. He reviewed them and immediately became suspicious. The applications were too clean, too perfect. Every single applicant claimed to have opposed the Nazi regime. Every single one claimed to have been forced to join the party. Every single one claimed to have never harmed anyone. Klaus had been doing this job for 3 years. He had reviewed thousands of visa applications from Europe. He knew what genuine applications looked like, and these did not look genuine. They looked manufactured. He requested the original background files. The Army refused. They said the files were classified for national security reasons. Klaus said he could not approve visas without seeing the complete records. The Army told him to approve them anyway. Klaus refused. He wrote a memo to his superior. The memo was dated November 1945. It said, "I have reviewed 23 visa applications for German scientists currently employed by the War Department. In my professional opinion, many of these individuals are inadmissible under current law. Their applications contain vague and unsupported claims about their activities during the war. I have requested complete background files and have been denied access. I cannot, in good conscience, approve these applications without full disclosure." The memo was forwarded up the chain. It reached the desk of the Secretary of State, James Burns. Burns called a meeting with the Secretary of War. They discussed the situation. The War Department made their position clear. These scientists were essential to national security. The Soviet Union was already using German scientists. The United States could not afford to fall behind. The visa approvals needed to go through. Burns agreed. He ordered the State Department to approve the visas. Klaus was told to stop interfering. He was told that decisions about national security were above his pay grade, that his job was to process paperwork, not to make policy. Klaus protested. He wrote more memos. He raised objections in meetings. He became a problem. In February 1946, he was reassigned to a different department, a job with no decision-making authority. He resigned 2 months later. Klaus spent the rest of his life trying to expose Operation Paperclip. He talked to journalists. He wrote articles. He testified before congressional committees. But no one listened. The program was classified. The press could not verify his claims. Congress had no interest in investigating. The war was over. The public wanted to move on. They did not want to hear about Nazis in America. They wanted to hear about prosperity, about the future, about the American dream. Meanwhile, the German scientists were arriving. In September 1945, Wernher von Braun and 127 engineers landed in the United States. They were taken to Fort Bliss, Texas, a military base near El Paso. The Army set up a research facility there. The Germans lived in barracks. They worked on rockets. They taught American engineers everything they knew about the V-2. Von Braun was paid $750 per month. That was more than 3 times what the average American factory worker earned. For comparison, a U.S. Army captain, which was equivalent to von Braun's SS rank, earned $300 per month. An SS officer who oversaw the deaths of thousands of prisoners was being paid 2.5 times what an American military officer earned. The facility at Fort Bliss cost the Army approximately $2 million to set up: equipment, housing, salaries, security. But the Army considered it a bargain, because the alternative was spending 10 years and hundreds of millions of dollars developing rocket technology from scratch. Von Braun and his team brought knowledge that was worth far more than what they were being paid. By 1950, more than 500 German scientists were working for the U.S. military. Not just at Fort Bliss, at facilities across the country. Some were working on rockets, others on jet engines, chemical weapons, biological weapons, radar systems, infrared technology, guided missiles. Some of these men had backgrounds that were even worse than von Braun's. There was Kurt Blom, who had conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners testing biological weapons. There was Walter Schreiber, who had overseen freezing experiments on prisoners at Dachau. There was Hubertus Strughold, who had conducted high-altitude experiments that killed dozens of prisoners. All of them had their files sanitized. All of them were brought to America. All of them were given jobs and salaries and comfortable lives, and all of it was hidden from the American people. In 1947, President Truman signed the National Security Act. It created the Department of Defense, the CIA, the National Security Council. It gave the military and intelligence agencies sweeping powers to classify information and operate in secret. Operation Paperclip was folded into this new structure. It became official policy, permanent, institutionalized. The CIA took over management of the program. They expanded it. By the time it ended in the early 1970s, more than 1,600 German scientists and technicians had been brought to the United States. The total cost of the program, including salaries, facilities, and support, was approximately $150 million. Adjusted for inflation, that is over $2 billion in today's money. But the real cost was not financial. The real cost was moral. The United States had made a deal with war criminals. It had chosen technology over justice. It had lied to its own people, and it had created a precedent, a pattern, a system where powerful people could escape accountability if they were useful enough. This pattern would repeat again and again in different contexts, with different people, but the same logic, the same calculation, the same willingness to sacrifice principles for advantage. And the man at the center of it all, Wernher von Braun, was about to become an American hero. Huntsville, Alabama, 1950, 5 years after the war ended. Huntsville was a small town, population 16,000. Cotton fields, textile mills, quiet, unremarkable. Then the United States Army arrived and changed everything. The Army built a massive facility called Redstone Arsenal. It covered 40,000 acres, research laboratories, test stands, machine shops, offices, housing for thousands of workers. The Army was moving its rocket program from Texas to Alabama, and Wernher von Braun was coming with it. Von Braun arrived in Huntsville in April 1950. He was 38 years old. He brought his wife and 3 children. The Army gave him a house, a nice house, 4 bedrooms, big yard, white picket fence, 2 blocks from a good school. Von Braun's salary was now $12,000 per year. That was more than 5 times the median American household income. He could afford a car, a television, a comfortable middle-class life. The people of Huntsville welcomed him. The mayor held a reception. The local newspaper published a profile. German rocket scientist brings space age to Alabama. The article described von Braun as a genius, a visionary, a man who would put America ahead of the Soviets in the race for space. There was no mention of the concentration camps, no mention of the slave labor, no mention of the SS, because nobody in Huntsville knew. The information was classified. And even if someone had known, would they have cared? Huntsville was poor. The Army base brought jobs, money, prestige. The town's economy was booming. New shops were opening, new houses being built, property values were rising. Von Braun was not just a scientist, he was an economic engine, and nobody wanted to turn off the engine. Von Braun thrived. He became an American citizen in 1955. He joined a Lutheran church. He gave talks at local schools about rockets and space exploration. He was charming, friendly. He spoke English with a slight German accent that people found endearing. He seemed like the opposite of the Nazi stereotype. He was not cold or cruel. He was warm, enthusiastic, optimistic. He talked about the future, about going to the moon, about colonies on Mars, about humanity spreading across the solar system. In 1952, von Braun wrote a series of articles for Collier's magazine. Collier's was one of the most popular magazines in America. Millions of readers. The articles were titled, "Man Will Conquer Space Soon." They described in detail how humans would build space stations, how they would land on the moon, how they would journey to Mars. The articles were illustrated with beautiful paintings by Chesley Bonestell. Gleaming silver rockets, astronauts in sleek spacesuits, space stations rotating against the backdrop of Earth. The articles were a sensation. They captured the American imagination. This was the future. This was what America could achieve, not war, not destruction, but exploration, discovery, progress. Von Braun became a celebrity. He started getting invitations to speak at universities, at conferences, on radio programs. In 1954, Walt Disney called. Disney was producing a television series called Disneyland. One episode was going to be about space travel. Disney wanted von Braun to be the technical consultant, and he wanted von Braun to appear on camera, to explain rocket science to American families. Von Braun said yes. The episode was called Man in Space. It aired in March 1955. 50 million people watched it. Von Braun appeared on screen in a suit and tie. He used models and diagrams to explain how rockets work, how you achieve orbit, how you escape Earth's gravity. He made it simple, clear, exciting. He made space seem inevitable, like the next logical step for humanity. President Eisenhower watched the episode. He was impressed. He started to understand that space was not just about science. It was about prestige, about showing the world that America represented the future, that capitalism and democracy produced better results than communism and dictatorship. But then came October 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It was a metal sphere about the size of a beach ball. It weighed 184 pounds. It did nothing except orbit the Earth and transmit a radio beep. But that beep changed everything. America was humiliated. The Soviets had beaten us into space. We had the German scientists. We had the technology. We had the money. How did we lose? The media exploded. Newspapers ran headlines about the missile gap, about America falling behind. Radio commentators warned that the Soviets could now launch nuclear weapons from space, that American cities were defenseless. The public panicked. Congress held hearings. They demanded answers. Why did the Soviets get to space first? Who was responsible? What was the government doing about it? President Eisenhower responded by creating NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a civilian agency dedicated to space exploration. And he made it clear that NASA's mission was not just scientific, it was political. Beat the Soviets. Show the world that America is superior. Win the space race. Von Braun was put in charge of developing the rockets. He was transferred from the Army to NASA. He became the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. His budget was enormous. In 1960, NASA's budget was $500 million. By 1965, it was $5 billion. By 1969, it peaked at over $5.9 billion per year. That was 4% of the entire federal budget. More than the United States was spending on education. More than it was spending on housing. Space was the priority. And von Braun was at the center of it all. He was not just building rockets anymore. He was managing a workforce of thousands of people. He was overseeing contracts with private companies, Boeing, North American Aviation, Douglas Aircraft, Grumman. These companies were building components for NASA, engines, fuel tanks, capsules, guidance systems, and they were making massive profits. North American Aviation won the contract to build the Apollo Command and Service modules. The contract was worth over $2 billion. That is over $20 billion in today's money. Boeing built the first stage of the Saturn V rocket. Their contract was worth $1.2 billion. Grumman built the lunar module. Their contract was worth $1.6 billion. These contracts made these companies rich, and the technology they developed, paid for by taxpayers, gave them a competitive advantage in other markets. Military contracts, commercial aviation, satellites. The space program was not just about beating the Soviets, it was about subsidizing American corporations, about building an industrial base that would dominate global aerospace for decades, and none of it would have happened without Wernher von Braun. Without his knowledge, without the years of research that he conducted in Nazi Germany using slave labor. The Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever built, was a direct descendant of the V-2. Same basic principles. Liquid fuel, multi-stage design, gyroscopic guidance. The V-2 was the prototype. The Saturn V was the finished product. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 launched from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 3 astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. Destination: the Moon. The rocket that carried them was the Saturn V, designed by Wernher von Braun's team. 4 days later, on July 20th, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the Moon. 600 million people watched on television. It was the most watched event in human history up to that point. President Nixon called it the greatest week since creation. Walter Cronkite cried on air. America celebrated. We had won. We had beaten the Soviets. We had done the impossible. Wernher von Braun was there at Mission Control in Houston. He was 57 years old. He was wearing a suit and tie. He was smiling, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. He had achieved his dream. His rockets had taken humanity to another world. Time magazine put him on the cover. The headline read, "Wernher von Braun, Rocket Man." The article called him a genius, a hero, the man who made the impossible possible. But not everyone was celebrating. There were protests. Small groups, mostly at universities. Activists held signs. Nazi war criminal. Built by slaves. Blood on the moon. They chanted outside NASA facilities. They wrote letters to newspapers. They demanded that von Braun be fired, prosecuted, deported. The protests got almost no media coverage because the media did not want to cover them. The moon landing was a triumph, a moment of national unity. A rare piece of good news in a decade that had been filled with assassinations and riots and war. Nobody wanted to hear that the triumph was tainted, that the hero was a war criminal, that the foundation of the achievement was built on bones, and von Braun never apologized, never admitted guilt. When journalists asked him about his Nazi past, he had a prepared answer. He said that he was a scientist, that he was not involved in politics, that he did not know about the concentration camps, that he had no control over how his rockets were used or who built them, that he was just doing his job. This was a lie. Von Braun visited Mittelwerk. He saw the prisoners. He knew they were dying. He signed documents approving the use of concentration camp labor. There are records, signatures, witness testimony. The evidence is overwhelming. But von Braun lied about it for the rest of his life, and the American government protected him. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting that Operation Paperclip was a mistake, that NASA was built by war criminals, that the moon landing, the greatest achievement in American history, came from knowledge gained through mass murder. Von Braun retired from NASA in 1972. He went to work for Fairchild Industries, a private aerospace company. His salary was $120,000 per year. That is over $800,000 in today's money. He lived comfortably, gave speeches, wrote books, received awards. He died in 1977, pancreatic cancer. He was 65 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people. NASA officials, corporate executives, politicians. They called him a visionary, a pioneer, a man who changed the world. His obituary in the New York Times was respectful. It mentioned his work on the V-2. It mentioned the moon landing. It called him one of the fathers of the American space program. It did not mention the 20,000 dead prisoners. It did not mention Adam Kabbalah watching him ignore a man being beaten to death. It did not mention that he wore an SS uniform. It did not mention that he built his career on slavery and then spent 30 years lying about it. But von Braun was not the only paperclip scientist. There were more than 1,600 of them, and they did not all go to NASA. Some went to other places, darker places. Kurt Blome went to the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. Blome had been a high-ranking Nazi doctor. He conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners testing plague and cholera as biological weapons. After the war, he was tried at Nuremberg. The prosecutors had evidence, witness testimony, documents with his signature. But Blome was acquitted. Why? Because American intelligence officers testified that Blome's research was valuable, that his knowledge of biological warfare was needed to counter the Soviet threat. 2 months after his acquittal, Blome was recruited into Operation Paperclip. He was brought to the United States. He worked at Camp Detrick in Maryland, later renamed Fort Detrick. He advised the U.S. biological weapons program. He was paid $60,000 over 2 years. When his contract ended, he returned to Germany. He lived quietly until his death in 1969. He was never prosecuted for his crimes. Walter Schreiber was another. He had been the chief medical scientist for the German army. He oversaw experiments at Dachau. Prisoners were submerged in ice water to test survival times. Others were placed in low-pressure chambers to simulate high altitude. Many died. Those who survived were often crippled or brain damaged. Schreiber signed off on these experiments. He reviewed the results. He published papers based on data gained from torturing prisoners. After the war, Schreiber was recruited by the U.S. Air Force. He worked at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in Texas. He advised on research into pilot survival, high altitude, extreme cold. The same topics he had studied using concentration camp victims. He was paid, protected, given a new identity. But in 1952, a journalist found out. A German newspaper published an article exposing Schreiber's past. The story was picked up by American papers. There was public outrage. The Air Force quietly terminated Schreiber's contract and helped him flee to Argentina. He lived there until his death in 1970. He was never prosecuted. Hubertus Strughold became known as the father of American space medicine. He worked for NASA. He conducted research on how the human body responds to space travel, weightlessness, radiation, long-duration flight. His work was essential to the Apollo program. There is a Strughold Award given by the Aerospace Medical Association. It is one of the highest honors in the field. But Strughold had been present at a conference in 1942 where Nazi doctors discussed experiments on prisoners, experiments involving rapid decompression, freezing, oxygen deprivation. Prisoners died in these experiments. Strughold's name appears in the conference notes. After the war, he claimed he attended the conference but did not participate in the experiments, that he just listened, that he objected privately. There is no evidence of any objection. But there is evidence that he used data from the experiments in his later work, that he cited the results in papers he published in the United States, that he built his career in part on knowledge gained from torturing prisoners to death. In 1993, the Aerospace Medical Association was petitioned to rename the Strughold Award, to remove his name because of his Nazi past. The association refused. They said that Strughold's contributions to space medicine were too important, that his legacy should not be judged by his wartime activities. The award is still called the Strughold Award today. These men were not isolated cases. They were part of a system that valued results over morality, that protected useful people and buried uncomfortable truths. That chose winning over being right. And that system was not limited to German scientists. It extended to other programs, other deals, other compromises. In the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA ran a program called MK-Ultra. It was a mind control research program. They dosed people with LSD without their knowledge. They conducted experiments on prisoners, on mental patients, on unwitting civilians. They wanted to know if they could break someone's mind, if they could erase memories, implant false ones, create programmable assassins. Some of the doctors who worked on MK-Ultra had connections to Operation Paperclip. They used techniques developed by Nazi doctors. They cited research from concentration camp experiments. They operated under the same logic. National security justifies any method. The ends justify the means. When MKUltra was exposed in the 1970s, there was outrage, congressional hearings, investigations, apologies, but no one went to prison. The program was shut down. The files were destroyed. The people responsible retired quietly because the system protected itself. The pattern repeated with torture programs after September 11th. Enhanced interrogation, black sites, rendition. The same logic, the same justifications. We are at war. The enemy is evil. We have to do terrible things to protect innocent people. And when the torture was exposed, there were investigations, reports, apologies, but no prosecutions, no accountability, because useful people are protected. Because the system values results over principles. This is the legacy of Operation Paperclip. Not just rockets, not just moon landings, but a precedent, a pattern, a culture where power protects itself, where institutions are never held accountable, where the past can be erased if it is inconvenient. Robert Persinger, the young soldier who walked into the tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora in April 1945, lived until 2003. He died at the age of 80. In all those years, he never saw Wernher von Braun face justice. He never saw anyone from Operation Paperclip prosecuted. He watched von Braun become a hero, watched him get rich, watched him die peacefully in his bed. Persinger did not talk about it much. When his grandchildren asked him about the war, he told them some stories about crossing the Rhine, about the German surrender. But he did not tell them about the tunnels, about the bodies, about the smell. That was too painful, too dark, some things you do not say out loud. But in 1969, when the moon landing happened, Persinger did not celebrate. He turned off the television. And when his wife asked him why, he said, "Because I know where those rockets came from." For 60 years, the full truth about Operation Paperclip remained locked away. The files were classified, marked top secret, kept in government archives that the public could not access. Researchers knew the program existed. Journalists wrote articles, historians published books, but they only had fragments, pieces of the puzzle. The complete picture was hidden. In 1973, a researcher named Linda Hunt was working on a story about Nazi war criminals who escaped justice. She heard rumors about German scientists working in the United States, scientists who had Nazi backgrounds. She started digging. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests. She asked for documents about Operation Paperclip. The government denied her requests. They said the files were classified for national security reasons, that releasing them would harm ongoing intelligence operations. Hunt did not believe them. The war had been over for almost 30 years. The Cold War was winding down. What national security interest could there possibly be in protecting the identities of retired scientists? She suspected the real reason was embarrassment, that the government did not want the American people to know what it had done, that it had lied for decades, that it had protected war criminals, that it had built NASA on a foundation of slavery and mass murder. Hunt kept pushing. She filed lawsuits. She appealed. She spent years fighting. In 1984, she finally got a small victory. A federal court ordered the government to release some documents, not all of them, just a few hundred pages, but it was enough. The documents confirmed what Hunt had suspected. Operation Paperclip had recruited war criminals, men with SS ranks, men who had worked in concentration camps, men who had overseen slave labor programs. And the government had deliberately falsified their records to get them into the country. Hunt published her findings in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in 1985. The article caused a small stir. Some newspapers picked it up, but it did not become a major scandal. The public was tired of hearing about World War II. It was old news, ancient history. People wanted to move on. Hunt did not give up. She kept researching. She interviewed former Paperclip scientists. She tracked down witnesses. She found more documents. In 1991, she published a book, Secret Agenda: The United States Government, Nazi Scientists, and Project Paperclip. The book named names. It provided documentation. It laid out the entire story in detail. The book sold moderately well. It got some reviews, but it did not change anything. Most of the scientists were already dead. The few who were still alive were elderly, in their 80s and 90s, too old to prosecute, too frail to send to prison. The statute of limitations had long since expired on most of the crimes, and the government had no interest in reopening old wounds. The Department of Justice did open a brief investigation in 1992. They reviewed Hunt's evidence. They admitted that mistakes were made. They said that some individuals had lied on their visa applications, but they concluded that there was insufficient evidence to bring charges, that too much time had passed, that witnesses were dead, that documents had been destroyed. The investigation quietly closed, but pressure continued to build. More researchers, more Freedom of Information Act requests, more lawsuits. Slowly, over the years, more documents were declassified. A few pages here, a few pages there. Each new release confirmed the same basic story. The government had known these men were war criminals, and it had brought them to America anyway. Then in 2006, something changed. The National Archives declassified a massive batch of Operation Paperclip files, thousands of pages, personnel files, background checks, intelligence reports, correspondence, memoranda. The full scope of the program was finally revealed. What the files showed was worse than anyone had imagined, not because the crimes were new, but because the level of knowledge and deliberation was documented in such detail. The government had not made mistakes. It had not been deceived. It had known exactly what it was doing, at every step, at every level. There were memos from 1945 discussing how to sanitize the files, specific instructions on what information to remove, what language to use, how to create a narrative that would be acceptable to the State Department and the American public. One memo, dated August 1945, was explicit. It said, "It is not intended that this information be made available to any agency outside the military." The backgrounds of these individuals, if fully disclosed, would preclude their entry under current immigration law. Files for visa purposes should be prepared separately. There were progress reports tracking the sanitization process. One report from November 1945 listed 23 scientists whose files had been successfully cleaned. Next to each name was a check mark and the word "cleared." The report noted that original files had been secured in a restricted archive. There were budget documents showing exactly how much Operation Paperclip cost. The program spent approximately $150 million between 1945 and 1973. That included salaries, research facilities, housing, relocation costs, and security. Adjusted for inflation, that is over $2 billion in today's money. $2 billion to protect and employ war criminals. There were contracts showing which corporations benefited from paperclip technology. Boeing received contracts worth over $3 billion for work that used rocket technology developed by von Braun's team. North American Aviation received over $2 billion. Grumman received $1.6 billion. These companies made massive profits from technology that was developed using slave labor in Nazi Germany, and the American taxpayers paid for it. There were performance reviews of the scientists, annual evaluations written by their American supervisors. Some of the reviews were glowing, describing the scientists as invaluable, as saving the United States years of research and billions of dollars. Other reviews were more troubling. One review of a chemical weapons specialist noted that the scientist continues to express admiration for National Socialist principles and makes inappropriate comments about racial matters. The recommendation was not to fire him. It was to remind him to be more discreet. There were surveillance reports. The FBI monitored some of the scientists, watched who they associated with, who they wrote letters to. Some of them stayed in contact with former Nazi colleagues in Germany. Some of them attended meetings of German-American organizations that had pro-Nazi sympathies. The FBI documented all of this, but did nothing. Because the scientists were too valuable to lose, and there were the witness statements, testimonies from concentration camp survivors who recognized the scientists, who saw them on television or in newspapers and said, "That is the man who was at the camp. That is the man who selected prisoners for experiments. That is the man who beat us." Some of these statements were taken seriously, investigated, but most were dismissed. The survivors were told they must be mistaken, that the scientist had an alibi, that he was somewhere else during the war. The survivors knew they were being lied to, but what could they do? They had no power, no money, no platform. They were just voices crying in the wilderness. The 2006 document release finally gave those voices validation. It proved they had been telling the truth, that the men they identified were exactly who they said they were. War criminals, murderers, men who should have been in prison, not working for NASA and collecting government paychecks. But by 2006, it was too late for justice. Every single paperclip scientist was dead. Wernher von Braun had been dead for 29 years. Kurt Blom had been dead for 37 years. The last surviving member of von Braun's original team died in 2001. There was no one left to prosecute, no one left to punish, no one left to face accountability. The American government issued a statement. It acknowledged that Operation Paperclip had involved individuals with Nazi backgrounds. It said that decisions made during that period reflected the urgent national security priorities of the early Cold War. It expressed regret that proper legal procedures were not always followed. But it stopped short of calling it a mistake. It did not apologize to the victims. It did not acknowledge that the program was fundamentally immoral. It just said that things were different back then, that people did what they thought was necessary at the time. This is the standard response whenever governments are caught doing something horrible. Acknowledge the minimum, express vague regret, insist that context matters, remind everyone that hindsight is 20/20, and then move on. Do not dwell, do not hold anyone accountable. Just turn the page and pretend it never happened. But some people refuse to turn the page. They refuse to forget. They insist on remembering, on documenting, on making sure that the truth is not buried again. One of those people was a historian named Annie Jacobsen. In 2014, she published a book called Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America. Jacobsen had spent years researching. She interviewed family members of the scientists. She tracked down declassified documents. She visited the sites where the scientists had worked, both in Germany and in the United States. Her book was more than just a history. It was an indictment. It argued that Operation Paperclip was not just a moral failure, it was a template, a blueprint for how governments justify doing terrible things in the name of national security. How they create systems that protect the powerful and punish the weak, how they lie to their own people and then claim they had no choice. Jacobsen pointed out that the logic of Operation Paperclip did not end in 1973. It continued, it evolved, it became institutionalized. The same government that protected Nazi war criminals later protected dictators who committed human rights abuses, as long as they were anti-communist. The same government that sanitized SS files later sanitized the records of CIA assets who ran drugs and tortured prisoners, as long as they were useful. The pattern is always the same. Find someone useful, overlook their crimes, create a false narrative about who they are, classify the evidence, lie to the public, and when the truth eventually comes out, express regret, but insist it was necessary. That there was no other choice, that the ends justified the means. This pattern did not start with Operation Paperclip, but Paperclip perfected it. It created a system, a process, a bureaucratic machinery for erasing the past and rewriting history. And that machinery is still running today. When the CIA tortured prisoners at black sites after September 11th, they used techniques developed by Nazi doctors: stress positions, sleep deprivation, waterboarding. These methods were studied and refined by doctors who had experimented on concentration camp prisoners. The CIA knew this. They cited the research in their training manuals. They did not care that the knowledge came from torture and murder. They only cared that it worked. When pharmaceutical companies test drugs in poor countries without proper consent, they are following a model established by Nazi doctors and refined by American researchers who worked with paperclip scientists. When tech companies collect data without permission and claim it is necessary for national security, they are using the same justifications. When governments classify evidence of crimes and say the public does not need to know, they are following the same playbook. Operation Paperclip taught the American government that it could get away with anything, as long as it was secret, as long as the files were classified, as long as the truth came out decades later when everyone involved was dead. There would be no accountability, no consequences, just a brief moment of embarrassment and then business as usual, and the American people let it happen. Because most of them do not know the history. They do not know about Operation Paperclip. They do not know that the moon landing was built on slave labor. They do not know that their government spent 60 years lying about it. They just know that America went to the moon, and that makes them proud. But pride, built on lies, is hollow. It does not mean anything. It is just propaganda. Just a story we tell ourselves to feel good. And when the truth comes out, when the lies are exposed, that pride collapses. And what are we left with? Just the uncomfortable realization that the things we celebrated were built on bones, that the heroes we worshipped were monsters, that the system we trusted was corrupt from the beginning. So what do we do with this knowledge? Do we cancel the moon landing? Do we tear down the statues of von Braun? Do we rename the buildings and awards and scholarships that bear the names of Nazi scientists? Some people say yes. They say that we should not celebrate achievements that come from evil, that honoring von Braun dishonors the 20,000 prisoners who died building his rockets, that keeping his name on buildings is a slap in the face to every Holocaust survivor. Others say no. They say that the moon landing was still an incredible achievement, that the science was real even if the scientist was flawed, that we should acknowledge the dark history but not erase the accomplishment, that context matters, that judging people from the past by the standards of today is unfair. Both arguments have merit, but they both miss the larger point. The question is not whether we should celebrate the moon landing. The question is why our government lied about it for 60 years, why it protected war criminals, why it chose technology over justice, why it prioritized winning over being right, and why it continues to make the same choices today. Because the real legacy of Operation Paperclip is not rockets or moon landings. It is a system that values results over morality, that protects useful people and punishes whistleblowers, that classifies crimes and declassifies them only when everyone responsible is safely dead. A system where power protects itself and ordinary people have no recourse. Robert Persinger understood this. He never forgot what he saw in those tunnels. He never forgot the smell, the bodies, the survivors who looked like walking skeletons, and he never forgot that the men responsible for that horror were brought to America, given jobs, given money, given respect, while the victims were forgotten. Persinger died in 2003. He was 80 years old. His obituary mentioned that he served in World War II, that he helped liberate concentration camps, that he was a veteran. It did not mention that he spent the rest of his life haunted by what he saw, that he could not watch the moon landing without feeling sick, that he knew the truth and nobody wanted to hear it. But now the files are open. The truth is available. Anyone who wants to know can know. The documents are online, in archives, in libraries. The evidence is overwhelming, undeniable. The American government brought Nazi war criminals to the United States. It gave them new identities, it paid them, it protected them, it lied about it for 60 years. And then when the truth came out, it shrugged and said that was a long time ago, that things were different, that we should move on. The question is whether we will move on, whether we will forget, whether we will let this become just another footnote in history. Another uncomfortable fact that we acknowledge briefly and then ignore, or whether we will remember. Whether we will use this knowledge, whether we will recognize the pattern and refuse to let it continue. Whether the next time our government says, "Trust us, this is classified, you do not need to know, national security requires it," we will push back. We will demand transparency. We will insist on accountability. We will refuse to accept that some crimes are too useful to punish. That is the real test. Not whether we judge Wernher von Braun. He is dead. His judgment, if there is one, is not ours to make. The test is whether we judge ourselves, whether we hold our own government to the standards we claim to believe in, whether we demand that power be accountable, that institutions tell the truth, that justice matters more than convenience. Samuel Klaus tried to stop Operation Paperclip. He failed. He lost his job. He spent the rest of his life trying to expose what happened. Nobody listened, but he left a record. He wrote memos. He documented everything. And 60 years later, when the files were finally opened, his memos were there. Proof that someone tried, that someone refused to go along, that someone chose principles over career. Linda Hunt spent years fighting to get the files declassified. She faced government stonewalling, legal obstacles, public indifference, but she did not give up, and eventually she won. Not a complete victory, not justice, but truth, and truth matters, because without truth there can be no justice, no accountability, no change. These people are the real heroes of this story. Not the rocket scientists, not the engineers, not the men who built machines, But the people who fought for truth, who refused to accept lies, who insisted that some things matter more than winning. If you made it this far, you are one of those people. You are someone who wants to understand, who refuses easy answers, who knows that history is not about memorizing dates and names. It is about recognizing patterns, about understanding how power works, about seeing when we are being lied to. And if you found this valuable, if it changed how you see the world, then maybe you share it. Not because I am asking, but because truth is rare, because most people do not know this story, because the system is counting on us to forget, to move on, to stop asking questions. There are not many of us left. People who read past the headlines, who ask where the money went and who benefited, who understand that every triumph has a cost and someone always pays it. If you are one of those people, you know what to do. You know that staying informed is not passive. It is an act of resistance against a system that thrives on ignorance. The next video will be another story they do not teach in schools, another deal made in secret, another lie that lasted decades, another pattern that keeps repeating because we keep forgetting. Stay sharp.